So, good morning, everyone, and welcome here to this magnificent room in the French Institute in Edinburgh for our, well, I would say Mark II of what was actually our International Women's Day event. And as you all know, International Women's Day is in March, not in November, but we fought the blizzards. And we decided at the time that it was, for safety reasons, not so good to do it then, so we're doing it now again. My name is Per Johansson. I'm the head of office of the European Parliament office in Edinburgh. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our current and former MEPs today about their thoughts on many, many different reasons surrounding women in politics and possibly the current developments that we are looking at today. Before we start, I just wanted to, and before I hand you over to Emma, our moderator, I just wanted to mention that we are, of course, looking forward to something big, we think, in the European Parliament next year. And I'm not talking about Brexit. I'm talking about the European elections, so the elections of the European Parliament in May of next year. Unfortunately, the way it looks today, UK citizens in the UK will probably not be able to vote in these elections. But for any EU citizens resident in the UK, you might, and I say might because not everyone will, have an opportunity to vote from the UK for your home country's quota of MEPs. In order to do so, I would recommend that you either check our website, where we have information about who can vote from where, and also to contact your consulates or embassies to see if you have to register, where you have to register, and what to do. I also would like to plug an initiative that we from the European Parliament have started in order to build a community around Europe around your citizens' right to vote and to use that right. This is a community, this is called thistimeimvoting.eu. And if you sign up there, you will not only get information from the European Parliament about the European elections and how you can vote and other things, but you will also be able to connect with others that are interested in these issues and that want to promote the direct elections in Europe as a good thing and as a real expression of your citizens' rights and your engagement in politics and in the society that we live in. So I would really recommend you doing that. If you need any more information, we're here, my colleagues are here, and you can also check our website and our social media to find out more. Also, before we start, I would like to thank my colleagues Daniel and Julia for being a very big part in setting all this up and to make this work. Last point is that after the event, at about 12 o'clock, after the Q&As, if you would like to join us for a light lunch of a sandwich and something to drink, you're more than welcome to. And also, you can have a chat with the panelists in a more one-to-one basis if you feel like doing that. But that's enough for me, and I will hand you over to our moderator, Emma.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and good morning to you all. I'm delighted to be here with all of you, marking International Women's Day some months late. We seem to be living the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I sit here today reflecting on the fact that we are in peril in terms of the European project, but also experiencing something of an upswing in terms of the Scottish commitment to women's equality and rights. And those two separate things that are going on, I think, are expressed beautifully in the discussion that we're going to be having today about women's experience of being in the European Parliament. As you will see, if you look at the biographical information that you've been given with your information for today, my organisation Engender works in Scotland on women's equality and rights. And one of the areas of work that we work on, along with many other colleagues across Scotland, is the question of women's political representation. And Engender, like other women's organisations, is really concerned that our decision-making bodies, our parliaments, our council chambers, our boardrooms are reflective of the gender balance of our society, because we know that when women are around the table in balance with men, different decisions get made. So this is not so much about jobs for the girls, but about the quality of decisions being made by and for our public. And the hope is that we'll see increasing balance, but the figures tell a slightly different story. And so we still have only roughly a quarter of councillors in Scotland who are women. Fewer than 4 in 10 MPs and MSPs are women. And in the European Parliament, we just have Catherine. I'm Rashina. Sorry, there's two of us. We have two. Absolutely right. Sorry, I think I've just lost my microphone. So we still see a dispiriting level of women's representation across our political spaces, making an impact on what then happens in those spaces. But today we're going to hear, I think, some positive stories about the impact that having women in political spaces can make on parliaments, can make on decisions. And so we're going to hear from MEP Catherine Styler. We had been going to hear from MEP Baroness Nashina Mubarak, but she unfortunately recorded a beautiful message for International Women's Day that was very time-specific to that moment and has not been able to re-record for today's session. And then we're going to hear from former MEP Elspeth Atwell from the Liberal Democrats. But before all of that, we're going to open up with some footage of former MEP Winnie Ewing in action in the Scottish Parliament.
Mr. President, when we faced the re-elections in 1984 and we're asked by the man in the street, what has or the woman in the street, perhaps I should say, what have we accomplished in the 5-year period? I think it will be tragic if we can't all say, whatever else we say, we have eliminated all discriminations against women in all member states. I remember as a small child, which gives my age away completely, seeing my cousin leave Glasgow with a great send-off with the Scottish section of the International Brigade. And he died as a result of his participation in that war. So that war in Spain, which is also not so long ago, is something we should bear in mind when we are arguing about the details of wine and fish and olive oil, which are very important. But I think we should put it into the perspective of the gravity of these events, which are just in my lifetime, for example. I had a letter recently from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation who are in utter despair. They didn't drink champagne or celebrate with euphoria when the Common Fisheries Policy was hailed as a superb deal by the UK government, but nevertheless they were prepared to see what could be made of it. And they point out we are now into the 7th month of 1983, and the two great boons that were promised, policing and certainty, have neither of them taken place. We were always told that one of the advantages of this community would be that in the world marketplace, we would be able to get fair dealing for our citizens. Now, we're not getting fair dealing. I know Mr. Blumenfeld referred to the number of hours a week, but we know that there are state subsidies, and that is partly why there's been the dramatic increase in the third world share, the Far East share of the shipbuilding market. Now, I remember the same argument about uneconomic pits when I was the member for Hamilton. What they did was they took all the pits, they drew a middle line, they said, everything below the middle line is uneconomic, and then when you close these ones down, the middle line goes up the way, and then the next lot are uneconomic. That is the argument, and the miners know it, and it's even been conceded by the other side that they're not in very sure ground about the argument of what are uneconomic pits to close. I'm the representative of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, your last wilderness, your only subarctic area, your most peripheral in the north, the most sparsely populated with 8 people per square kilometre, 91 islands the size of Denmark. We've always been treated in the same way as Ireland, and we've always been treated by this community fairly. In all the horrors of wars and terrors, surely nothing can be as horrific as the torture of children and youths for the sins or alleged sins of their parents. It's almost defying our imagination to put ourselves in the shoes of these mothers, asked to pay for the bodies of their dead children and learning that they'd been tortured. Imagine the agony when they had to imagine themselves, these mothers, what their own children must have suffered. And the agony of those who await the news of the missing children must now be compounded. What can we do? Well, I think we can do what we're doing. We can protest. And we know that sometimes our protests from our democratic parliaments of the world have positive results. And we know that because we have Mr. Sharansky here today. We can protest, and we can protest in a totally unified voice. And I'm happy to say that we did reach a compromise text.
Madam, across there. Madam, across there, advocating for Scotland and for a wide range of social issues within the European Parliament. And I think one of the things that speaks to engender most about the European Parliament is the extent to which gender is baked into the deliberations and discussions through gender mainstreaming. But clearly, obviously, the Parliament deals with a wide range of technical issues, and we'll come on to that in speaking to Catherine and to Elspeth presently. But first of all, I'd like to invite Catherine Styler, MEP from the Labour Party, to speak. She was elected as the youngest British MEP in 1999 and has always been a strong and committed campaigner for Scotland and for Labour in Europe, and has a wide range of interests: consumer protection, economics, construction products and lung disease, and is a member of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee and a substitute on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Emma. Well, I'll just stand because I think it's easier to speak and to talk, and we've each, I think, got 5 minutes, but it's just, I thought that was a lovely way to introduce things, seeing Winnie Ewing speak there. And I think that her message and a number of the points she was making was really about the peace project that the European Union is. And I think that's something that certainly I feel very strongly about. And it was one of my colleagues who said that the European Parliament is the most important peace project that the world has ever known, where countries that used to fight one another now work so peacefully. And it just happened like last Thursday, actually. I was at the National Library of Scotland's opening of their latest exhibition. I can highly recommend it to all of you. It's a free exhibition just literally 2 minutes from here, about the aftermath of the First World War and what happened to people when they came back. And I think one of the biggest migrations that ever happened in Scotland was actually after the First World War, where 40,000 Scots had little opportunity. And it wasn't until after the end of the Second World War that the opportunity came of better housing, of a health service, and all of those things that we now really take for granted. But I just think this message of peace is so important, and one that we should never, ever forget. But I'm here to talk about gender. And I think it's interesting when you said I was the youngest elected representative, and it was really great that Katrina, who used to work with me, is here in the audience, because when I was elected at 25 and going into the Parliament, often people thought I was my male colleague's secretary, that I was often questioned. It's a bit like when you go in and you're ID'd about alcohol sales and things, you're always questioned about whether you should be actually coming into the building. And sometimes you reflect on that. I'm never questioned now about going into the building. So when you're elected young, there's one thing about that, you just get older. But there is something about the fact now in the Parliament, it is great to see so many more young women in the European Parliament. The fact that when I had my children, it was very accepted that you know, because there's another aspect of being young and having children as an elected representative, and that is that in the European Parliament there's no real maternity leave. But when you had, and that's another question about equality that I think we really do need to address about elected women's representation, but I think also the fact that it was just very acceptable. You put the baby into the baby born and you walked into the chamber and there was no questions asked. And it's quite interesting. It was only very recently, I think, that Jo Swinson, when she went into the House of Commons, that everyone was like, that's amazing. And the thing was, in the European Parliament, it's been a very common occurrence that you were allowed to do that. It was very much accepted. I'll reflect on a story, actually, that when I had my son Andrew, I went into the chamber, it was January, and it was the election of the new president of the European Parliament. And I'd been there for a number of years, and they pick out of a box the people that are going to be the tellers for this election. Of course, in all the years I've never been picked, but that one time, my name comes out the box and I have to put my hand up in front of everybody to say, I'm really sorry, but I cannot stand with an 11-week-old baby and do this, to which, a very tense moment in the European Parliament, in which the President of the European Parliament said, oh, congratulations, and people clapped and applauded the fact that there I was with the baby, with Andrew. And I just thought there was something, again, very endearing and very inclusive about that. And maybe that is part of the culture of the Parliament. I think maybe Elspeth will reflect on that too. I mean, there's only ever been, you can correct me, but just writing our names down, there's only ever been 5 female MEPs, is that correct? Has everybody got 5, isn't it? Is that right? And I think about that, and I think about how Janie Buchan sadly has passed away, but there are still us who are alive today, and we should really celebrate the fact of Scottish women's involvement in the European Parliament, in the European process, and really reflect upon the achievements. Now, yes, I haven't been in the Women's Rights Committee, Emma's right, I've been in different committees in my time in the Parliament. When I was first elected, Elspeth and I served in the Fisheries Committee together, which was a real experience, and it was in that time that we got regional advisory councils, got more regionalisations of the fisheries policy. It's interesting that Winnie was talking about fish, and what we're talking about today, we're talking about fisheries policy, aren't we? It's in the papers and all of that today. Then Elspeth and I, in the 2004 to 2009 Parliament, we worked in regional policy, and at that time there was real fearfulness that we wouldn't get some of the regional monies that we've been used to, and we worked together as a Scottish team, and our colleagues who'd just come in from Central and Eastern European countries had said, actually, we agree with you, you should still have access to this funding, and we managed to achieve that, and that was something I think very, very proud of, Elspeth. And then, as Emma says, I'm vice chair of the Single Market Committee. It's the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee. Just now, I lead on copyright reform, which might not seem of good, but it's just absolutely critical in our digital world today that we get that balance right. And I'm working really hard at the moment in trilogue negotiations on a very kind of complex issue, one which maybe people are maybe not so in, but is something that's very, very important for the digital reality that exists within. And then there's all the kind of technical stuff I've done in construction products and gas appliances, Solvency II, and I could go on. But the opportunity I've had representing Scotland and working in the European Parliament has been a real privilege and a real honour. And it's one which, in the almost 20 years that I've been there, I feel I have delivered in terms of improving, say, in gas appliances to make sure that carbon monoxide detection was much more high in a very technical report, in construction products, bringing safety to the fore, in copyright, trying to make sure that for our researchers there aren't barriers and money involved when it comes to publishing, that we can have open access and open data and all of this piece. So I'm conscious I've probably spoken for more than 5 minutes, but it's just such a privilege to be able to stand with Elspeth, well, you're not standing, you're sitting, Elspeth, but to be here with someone I've got great respect for, who I worked really strongly with, and it was that kind of cooperation and that consensual decision-making that you could have at a European level, which was a great benefit to us all. I felt that we could work cross-party, cross-country to achieve real benefits for our citizens, and that's something I'm really going to miss, and clearly I'll maybe end in I'm trying to be very positive. Clearly at the moment things are, shall we say, in a very, very dark place when it comes to what's happening with Brexit. Clearly at the moment we know the withdrawal agreement is there, the political declaration is now out there. It looks as though that will not be able to get carried to the House of Commons, so where does that leave us with? And I've been advocating now for some time that really we have to have a people's vote on what our future will be, and the clock is ticking and time is going. I'm very disappointed in my own political party's leadership at the moment, where I just firmly think that we should be really front and centre against Brexit. And although there are things that are happening which have, movement as such, I just feel that there's more to be done. But the place that I'm in at the moment is that with everything that's going on for the future of our country and for the future of our citizens and the benefits that we currently enjoy and what we're about to lose, we cannot crash out of the European Union. We must do everything we can to look at the hard facts and be able to put this to the people and say, what is it that we want? And I believe that remaining part of the European Union has to be part of that picture. So thank you for listening to me. And over to Emma and Elspeth, and thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Catherine. So we're now going to hear from Elspeth Atwell, who probably needs very little introduction to this audience. But for those of you who do not know her yet, she's a former MEP for Scotland, having stood as a parliamentary candidate for Glasgow Maryhill in every general election from October 1974 to 1997, part of the Liberal Democrat delegation to the Scottish Constitutional Convention, and taught jurisprudence and comparative law at the School of Law at the University of Glasgow. In the European Parliament, Elspeth drafted a number of influential reports, including one on community action in relation to whaling and another on women's networks in fisheries, and is a passionate advocate of radical decentralisation of the common fisheries policy. And it's taking everything I have not to ask her to comment on today's newspaper headlines. So, Elspeth, take it away.
Thanks very much, Emma. I think I want to begin by saying just how rewarding it was to work in the European Parliament. And I've been trying to work out why. I don't think it was just that around 1/3 of the MEPs there were women. That a lot of them were clearly influential as well. So the whole time I was there, I never felt that my gender actually made any difference. Nor was it just to do with the fact that issues about gender were taken seriously, though they clearly were. I remember at one stage, I was a member of a high-level group on gender equality, and trying to explain to a somewhat bewildered male colleague in my less than adequate French just what gender mainstreaming actually was. I think it was probably largely to do with the way in which we actually operated. Back in my previous work life, I became interested in feminist legal theory. One writer, Carol Gilligan, suggested that men were prone to abstract ideas and formal justice, whereas women were much more concerned with relationships and interconnectedness. I've never been entirely happy, I have to say, with generalizations of this kind. For example, my husband was highly intuitive, whereas I have a much more analytical approach. But that I felt so comfortable in the European Parliament made me think that there was something, at least, in what she said. Perhaps it was to do that we sat in a hemicycle designed to be non-confrontational. In fact, and Catherine will remember, that when somebody did become strident or insulting, there was a kind of collective shudder that ran round the house. Perhaps, too, it was something to do with the fact that we sat alphabetically in political groups rather than according to nationality, which gave it something of a family feel. And indeed, one could develop friendships across the political groups, nationalities and generations true, and I'm so proud to count Catherine as one of my friends. Most of all, I think, though, it was to do with the way of working, and Catherine has already begun to allude to this. Partly the fact that the lead in law and policy making was shared out between the political groups according to size, and within them according to the interests of the people involved. So there was no sense of being a permanent backbencher with no real say. One could, if one became a rapporteur, steer things through the Parliament as a whole, or even as a shadow rapporteur, advise one's own political group as to how to react, and indeed negotiate with the actual rapporteur with the view to find a compromise. Doing so was very much the order of the day. Of course, this was by no means always successful, but it very often was. And now, in my usual normal fashion, got two pieces of paper stuck together. Thanks, Catherine. The point here, though, is that people sometimes suggest that compromising and trying to achieve a consensus means settling on the lowest common denominator. And I do have to say, in recent days, I think we've had a prime example of that. But in the Parliament, I believe that rather than the lowest common denominator, the outcome was, much more often than not, the highest common factor. Now, you may well think that I'm wearing some retrospective rose-coloured spectacles, and there might just be some truth in that. There were bad times and downsides. And the things I remember as having both downsides and upsides were the variety and the amount of travelling involved. Both meant a permanent fight against tiredness, and how Catherine coped with all she did and 2 young children, I can never begin to imagine. I think back sometimes to what I call the worst Wednesday. I probably muddled up the details, but I recall that it began at 8 a.m. with a breakfast meeting, the subject of which has got lost in my mind in the midst of time. But the meetings ran non-stop all day, including being lobbied about ports, being lobbied about agency workers, meeting a delegation from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, attending a group meeting, meeting a delegation of Irish fishermen, and finally back in the office after all this, some casework, of which there was regularly a considerable amount. Finally, at 8 p.m, it was off to a reception at the Committee of the Regions. I said hello to a couple of people there that I knew, looked at the long queue for the buffet, and reprehensibly fled back down the road to my flat, had some Marmite on toast, and fell into bed. As for the travelling, it wasn't just the increasing complexity of getting from Glasgow to Brussels and Strasbourg, but Fridays and Saturdays spent in the various airts and perts of Scotland. Only Sundays were available for home life. My husband used to say that they were there for getting reacquainted with him, my laptop, and the washing machine, although not necessarily in that order. Being the only Scottish Liberal Democrat, I had to cover the whole of the country, and again with enormous variety, meeting groups of fishers and farmers, holding surgeries, seeing forestry and employment projects, and various others where European funding was being used, giving talks to schools, attending conferences, and visiting production sites. I think that by the time I finished, I could have conducted tours of distilleries and fish processing plants all on my own. It wasn't just those, though. I include, for example, seeing paint being mixed, aerospace parts, sausages, and Tunnock's caramel wafers being made. You probably do not need to ask which of those I enjoyed the most. So, my life as an MEP, tiring, even exhausting. Yes, and I could not have survived without an incredibly tolerant husband and great teams of young assistants in my support. Exhausting, yes, but boring, never. When I decided not to stand again in the 2009 election, it was with considerable reluctance. But a mixture of yearning for more time at home and serious doubts as to whether I could, at my age, have the stamina to keep up the pace for another 5 years came together to tip the balance. After I retired, my assistants over the years came together to hold a party and presented me with a bound volume, I boast PhD in size, of the reports and opinions I had written over the 10 years of my parliamentary career. It is very reassuring to be able to look back and to be able to say that there are a number of bits of European law and policy that are there because I was there. This is not meant to be a boast. So many MEPs, Catherine included, can say exactly the same. But it does explain why I get so angry when the European Union is accused of being undemocratic. Finally, what I believe was the most rewarding of all was the extent to which the Scottish MEPs bonded together to serve the people of Scotland. I don't think the Spanish in particular realised what had hit them when 4 of us, one from each of the political parties represented, came together on the Fisheries Committee. And I don't think, actually, they ever quite recovered from it. Being part of Team Scotland was a great privilege, and I shall always be grateful that I had the opportunity to be so. Like Catherine, I hope and pray that the United Kingdom thinks again, that we have a people's vote, and this time we vote to stay.
Thank you so much for that, Elspeth. That was terrific. We're now going to move into some questions and answers. So I'd like to invite the audience members to give some thought to questions they would like to put to our panel. If I may, I'm going to open with a couple of questions to give you some reflection time. And the first of these is based on some of the things that you covered in your inputs, both of you, about domestic life, and something that Engender deals with is the overwhelming likelihood of women to do care for children, for sick people, for older people, for disabled people within the household, and how challenging that can be to combine with political career. Now, when your political life takes you not only to Brussels and Strasbourg, but all around Scotland to speak to the people of Scotland, how do you do that? And I suppose what has the European Parliament got right that other councils and parliaments in the UK could learn from? Because actually, per the proportion of women, although it's been very low, at the moment it's better than local government in Scotland. Yeah. So that's even with all the travelling. So your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that people need encouragement and support. I mean, Els was reflecting on the fact that, what Dawn said to you about, the washing machine, the laptop. I mean, my husband is, again, really supportive. My mum and dad help me with my childcare, but they're getting older, And I think that these differing responsibilities that we have, and we go abroad and come back, I think that just having a flexibility, a family-friendly environment, things about acceptability of it. The culture in the European Parliament, probably because of my Swedish and Danish colleagues, my Swedish colleagues would be replaced for their maternity leave. And you can see the difference in the culture there and the possibilities. I also serve in the Norway, Iceland and delegation, which also includes Switzerland too. But when you look at what's happening in Iceland, you look at what happens in Norway, how you can do things differently and that you can do things inclusively. The European Parliament, I think, has got some of that balance right. There's still things to go, but I think that that support and that encouragement was deeply helpful. But, again, I don't think, reflecting on this in 20 years, if I had my children before I was elected, I'm not sure whether I would have got to be elected. And the thing was, I was able to have my family and balance that. I feel deeply fortunate that I could do that, but that was because I had my parents and my husband who were really, if I'm honest, were really supportive and had that flexibility. So, it's hard, Emma. It's not easy travelling every week, but so that's my reflection. Elsa, what do you think?
Oh, well, Catherine, you've got much more experience of the issues than me. I was in reasonably advanced years before I actually got into the Parliament. I think one thing, and it's not really to do with childcare and support, although that's an element, but one thing that does put off women from becoming engaged in politics, whether at council level or Scottish Parliament level or Westminster Parliament level, is the fact that they, and the Scottish Parliament less so, but do tend to be confrontational. And I don't think women actually like that way of working. I mean, again, I'm generalizing. There are obviously a few that do like being confrontational. But I think the bulk of women feel that they want to make a contribution. And sometimes it's quite difficult to. I mean, they may not have a political party that they really feel they can subscribe to. They may have problems getting selected, and some research I did in my own party, this is going back now, so I'm not sure it's true, was that women tended not to get selected for the really winnable seats until they were actually past childbearing age, which is a matter for concern. So I think sometimes women sort of get discouraged, say, I want to make a contribution, but I'm not sure politics is the way to do it. That there are ways in which I won't have the problems of having to find childcare or not that degree of childcare, where I can make a contribution which will actually be easier, less of a struggle, and make that contribution. So I think that there is a problem there of finding ways that we can make it better for women to be in active politics.
So what I'm hearing from both of you, not to put words into your mouth, is marry well, but that actually the systems need to shift. If you haven't got a supportive context, then you really need the systems to change to enable that participation.
My husband's a commercial lawyer, and we just found it too difficult. So now he's in-house with the Church of Scotland as one of the I mean, he's really happy in his work, but that is what you have to make decisions about your work-life balance, and you have to have that support there to be. So it's just, yeah, I mean, I'm very, very lucky. My husband's Californian, so maybe that's something as well. But I think that just in generally. But then you mentioned, Emma, that you would think the local government then would have more people because it's more locally based and you're more accessible and all of this. And so I think there's a cultural element to politics that has to try and be changed. I mean, we try and change it by being present, by raising issues, by making sure there's better maternity and paternity cover, that childcare is shared. I mean, childcare costs are still a huge thing for people. I mean, it's really, and it is huge in Scotland. And, you know, we really have to, I mean, that's one of the Nordic examples is where childcare, sorry, I'm looking at pairs over there, I don't mean to stereotype, but it is an issue where, about balance, and you learn about what happens in Sweden, and certainly my colleagues from when I do the Icelandic and Norwegian stuff, and you look at it and you go about the affordability, and therefore there's an issue, and also shared parenting. I mean, I think that's such a big issue about that joint responsibility that you have when you are parents together.
Absolutely, absolutely. To kind of pivot slightly to your very kind of detailed work within the Parliament, and obviously you've both been involved in technical areas, as has Nashina, also working on fisheries, forced marriage, but public procurement, which is an incredibly detailed area of work of great relevance to Scottish businesses and also to equality. How do you go about, or do you think you do go about, bringing gender into those questions? What difference does it make to have women around the table when you're considering something like gas appliances or copyright or fisheries?
I think that gender mainstreaming is much more part. I mean, when we were first elected, it was kind of this novel thing. Now in everything, you have to think about those dimensions, so that's a good thing. And it's not just coming from the. So we have rapporteurs and shadows. It's not just that somebody wants to. It's actually now kind of much more there. I think that's a good thing. If you look at my stuff on gas appliances, we were just talking about this and trying to make sure that I mean, these are technical dossiers that you have responsibility for to make the single market work properly and effectively, to make sure that goods can cross borders and that we know the standards are going to be right. So how do you do, and we were talking about how, you know, what's more kind of relevant than saying your gas boiler, particularly in days like this, can work and is safe, and you know that it's of a standard that's going to be okay, and that carbon monoxide is much more of an issue across the board. So, you know, in that term, therefore, you're making a difference. But then maybe we didn't sell it like that. We sell, you know, we talked about it as a single market technical measure rather than something that impacts on every single person's daily lives to make sure your home is safe. And maybe that's a challenge, I think, that the work that we did at the European Parliament sometimes has, that these technical works that we do, which are about standardisation and making sure things are safe, and safety goods, whether it's food or water, whatever it is, that we maybe are not communicating in the way that people can relate to. And that's maybe one of the challenges that we face in the UK, certainly, that for 40 odd years, our country has Europeanised failure and nationalised success. And therefore, we've never looked at how you know, national governments actually, whether that's Conservative, Labour, whoever, it's, you know, it's a joint way of working. And I think that's also, you know, a real key issue about how in the future we should definitely think much more carefully. And in fact, the European Parliament election campaign already has started, and part of that is much more about citizens. I mean, in a way, it's never really been about the relevance of the day-to-day work that we do, and the fact that it impacts and affects the quality of people's lives. And I think that's a really good way to try and you know, give an example of how impactful the work that we do. I don't know if you agree, Elspeth.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Catherine said, but there were times also when it was much more directly to do with gender, as well as the committees you mentioned, Emma. I spent quite a lot of time on the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, and I think, well, several things stick in my mind from that time, but I'll only mention two of them. One was to do with temporary agency workers, and the bulk of temporary agency workers are women, but there was a real rearguard action against getting regulations in to protect them. And there were delegations of employers that came to see me, and I must say, towards the end I was behaving very badly, because they would come in and I would say, now, what you want to tell me is this: do you have anything to add? And they might or might not, but normally they would say, no, I think that covers it, and get up and go out again. Because I was just beginning to get so angry about that. And the other one was in terms of equal access to services for women, which was going through the Parliament. And again, it was insurance companies that were really trying to make life difficult there. And they kept coming in and saying, you realise that if you have equality there, then young women are going to have to pay much more in order to get motor insurance, which somebody actually told me was not the case. There were smart ways of doing it which could avoid that, completely ignoring the fact that where women were disadvantaged, where annuities and things were concerned. So I think all the time, you just had to have an eye on what was going on and why it was that women were being disadvantaged.
I mean, but both of you have kind of alluded to this, but clearly our anti-discrimination law in the UK, which is reserved to Westminster, is underpinned by European law. Whatever happens next, and I guess Engender has its own perspective about whether we should be moving forward with a people's vote to give women a say on the future of the UK's relationship with the European Union, and Scotland's within that. Whatever happens next, how can Scotland work on improving conditions for women's equality with the EU, this vital source of all of this anti-discrimination law? Or can it?
I mean, it's a good question, because firstly, we don't know what's going to happen with this withdrawal agreement or the political declaration. We were told that the numbers just don't add up for getting it through the House of Commons. So what does that mean? It means that there's very few options open to us in terms of, you know, that's why I think a people's vote is actually becoming stronger and stronger by the day, because if everything, no deal should never be no deal is no, we cannot have a no deal situation. We have to have either something that is the same as what we have, which is basically remaining part of the European Union. And I think that looking at the mess of where we are, I think, somebody said to me, democracy's got us into this mess, Catherine. Democracy can get us out of this mess. And I think, well, there's some truth to that. I mean, it's just, but the time is ticking. And I think that if we're wanting to have something, I mean, we've got the Article 50 court case next week at the European Court of Justice. Obviously, they won't rule on that on the day, but that's happening. You've got the debate coming up in the House of Commons from the 10th of December, I think, on the withdrawal agreement. We've got the summit, obviously, on Sunday, so some are even saying we don't know whether the summit will actually take place if Spain, but Spain can say this, but still, if there's a majority. So, I mean, it's just hugely confusing. But what I think is clear to me is that, how can anyone look at this and say our country is going to benefit from it, full stop? And so if you really do want to look after the communities that you serve and the people that you represent, and if you really want people to kind of remain in employment in certain aspects of jobs and employment and all of this, you cannot crash out of the European Union, and you have to either remain part of the European Union or still be part of the single market and customs union. And the current government says the customs union single market and the EU customs. I mean, I don't know what customs union you think they're going to really go into unless it's definitely the EU customs union. So I think that the people's vote is the one thing that could get through the House of Commons to say, look, our democracy can't make a decision on this, our parliament can't make a decision on this, it's back to the people, and everyone can then look at what this withdrawal thing is and say, well, does that give us, and it doesn't give us what we have at the moment at all, one bit. So, interesting times ahead, uncertain times ahead. And in terms of equality, well, where does this take us to? I don't think it takes us to a better place, frankly. I think this takes us to a place where rights are going to be absolutely under pressure for the vision some people want to see of us kind of ignoring rights, whether that's at the workplace or whether it's basic fundamental rights or whatever. So, sorry, Elspeth.
I mean, I agree with you entirely, Catherine. I suppose the only sort of thought I have is if the worst does come to the worst, then I do have rather more faith in the Scottish Parliament than I do in the Westminster one to stick with these matters. And actually a very close personal relationship has been built up over the years between the European Parliament office in Scotland, the European Commission office, MEPs and former MEPs, people involved in charitable organisations. And that closeness could continue. And we still don't know quite what powers the Scottish Parliament is going to have either. But insofar as it has powers which are to do with protecting not just gender equality, but diversity of every kind, then I'm hoping there will be a close enough sort of relationship which continues what has been established and allows the Scottish Parliament basically to mirror what's going on in Europe.
Yeah. There is an argument just now among some organisations about the value of keeping funding organisations at a Brussels level, and I'm like, there's never been a more important time to keep funding organisations at a Brussels level because you still need to have influence as well. And so I think there's an argument actually, especially amongst some of the different kind of cross, there's a number of organisations that you'll be aware of that have got a great voice, great footprint in Brussels and great influence at the moment, and the partnerships that they've developed are still relevant, really relevant today. So,
I mean, as a really brief NGO example from my bit of the world, Engender is remaining part of the European Women's Lobby.
Good. That's good.
And we're changing our statutes. The European Women's Lobby is changing its statutes to allow those who once were member states but perhaps have changed their arrangements and relationships to stay in. So let's continue to do that work. Right, I'd now like to throw it open to the floor. We have a roving mic, so please wait until that comes to you to ask a question. I'm going to take 3 questions now, if I can. I see a hand at the back, a hand there, a stripy jumper, and a hand. You were first, I think. Sorry for pointing.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I'm Katrina Burness. I used to work in the European Parliament and worked with Catherine and Elspeth. I have a hypothetical question about a hypothetical situation.
Thanks, Katrina. She's our friend as well. Better be a good question, Katrina.
Is it in 5 parts?
It's it's not even in 6 parts. It's about, has there been any discussion? I know it's hardly the immediate matter in hand at the moment, but has there been any discussion around what would happen should the United Kingdom happen not to leave the European Union, and what that would mean in terms of European elections and representation in the European Parliament?
Very good question, thank you. Can we go to the back now? Thank you.
Hello. My question is more about equality in women, and that relates to, obviously, you might have more legal knowledge than myself, Elspeth, because I don't have any. The Sex Discrimination Act's been about for probably as long as the European Parliament has. And Catherine, you say quite an important thing there. You say that there was a lot of legislation made, but it's only really in this session you're actually looking at how it affects citizens. And you both have discussed Scotland being at the forefront and possibly being better off in terms of equalities than other places. But the chair then says that equalities are reserved. And Scottish Parliament did for a long period, probably the first 6 years, claimed that equalities were reserved. But equalities, even if it's UK legislation, it can't be ignored in Scotland, but it pretty much has been ignored. There's quite a high proportion of women working in education. Yeah, I'm going to cut me. High proportion of women in education, in health and law. So my question is, why do we not have equality in Scotland just now? Why do we need a change in European intervention, or why is it not happening? Where's the enforcement for Europe from the citizens here just now? Because it seems to be a paper exercise.
Thanks very much. So why do we not have equality in Scotland right now? And third question, stripy jumper.
I'd like to ask a couple of short questions, if possible, on the current situation.
You may have one question, sir.
Okay. Okay, I'll go for the easy one. The people's vote has been mentioned 2 times this morning. What questions would be on the ballot paper?
Very, very good question. Okay, so we have 3 questions. Has there been any discussion around what would happen if the UK stayed a member of the European Union, particularly in terms of the forthcoming European Parliament election? Secondly, why do we not have women's equality or gender equality in Scotland right now? And thirdly, what question would be on the ballot if there were to be a people's vote?
Okay, do you want me to start?
So, any of those bits you'd like.
No, so Katrina, I think that some of the thoughts that are around just now, and on talking to some people in the Parliament on Wednesday, some thoughts are that if the withdrawal agreement cannot be agreed at the House of Commons, then you're going to have either an extension of Article 50 to therefore then allow a people's vote. What does that mean for us in the European elections? Some say that we would still not have a European election in May, but if we did go forward to have a people's vote, which then said that we were remaining part, and still under Article 50, because remember, if we come out on the 29th, then we are a third country. We are a third country. We don't, and this is really quite, the timings of this are just, in my mind, and maybe other people have different perspectives, are just so important, all of this. Because part of me thinks, well, if we want to have a people's vote, we have to have it before the 29th of March. If there's not an extension of Article 50, if there is an extension of Article 50, then you have a little bit more leeway, but not too much leeway, because you would say they would perhaps extend it to a certain amount of time to allow us to have that vote, to be able to reflect what the will is of the British people. So, but at the moment, as things currently stand, and as the current government is saying, is that we're leaving on the 29th of March. What they have done is this withdrawal agreement, which is not going to go anywhere, but that is what they say is what is on the table. And this maybe leads me, I'm going to go back to the gender equality question. I'm going to then segue into the third question about what would be on the ballot paper, because I think this is really important. So what would we have? Would we have the option of this withdrawal agreement as do you want this or not? And if not, it's the status quo, which is full membership of the EU. So in my mind, I think something along those lines, but it will be up to the Electoral Commission, won't it not, to determine what the question would be on a ballot paper. And then the question really is, if the House of Commons have a vote and reject it, then is that it completely gone? But then you've got the member states, the 27 member states, who are now meeting, have looked at it and saying, well, this is... So it is a deeply complicated question, actually, about what would be on the ballot paper. But to me, in my mind, is you'd have to say to people, do you want, with looking at what has happened, and if this is the best that this can come up with, and even those who've been advocating us leaving are now saying we should remain part of the European Union. I mean, some of them arch Eurosceptics are saying that we should remain part of the European Union. Then I think that the question has to be clear that the option is to remain fully as a member of the European Union, however that is termed within the question. But to me, that's the only, either you have what she has negotiated, or we remain part of the European Union. And I don't think you can go into third questions and fourth questions and all of this. I think it has to be very, very clear, unlike the previous question, which I think was not clear. Because now, we've moved from having 3 words against remaining part of the EU, which were take back control. We've now got a 585 page document, plus a 26-page political declaration to say, do you want this compared to what you have at the moment? What are you going to lose? And so I think today we have a clearer outline of what leaving the European Union actually looks like, and in my mind is nothing what we benefit from, but is remaining a part of the EU. On equalities, I always think equalities is a work in progress, because I think that at the moment we've got the legislation outline that we've had and we've worked upon at an EU level. You're right about when it comes to what happens in Scotland, and I think that is a question we have to think about in terms of the context we now will hopefully not exist within, but the challenges that we face. But fighting for equality is something that we will always have to have on the agenda. And I think things at the moment, when you look at some of the statistics showing that in terms of how equality is looking in our country, it's going back the way rather than forward. So we need to address that in our country as well. But I think it's a good question to ask what happens. I will fight for equality. I will fight for good legislation. Yes, it's about how you regulate that legislation, how you monitor it. But we have to always ensure that the equalities debate is there and is part of all political manifestos and is part of our political process. But I think that the fact that we've still got to fight for it, there's questions around that, but I think we've still got to make sure that it's there as an issue. No?
Yeah, I think Catherine's really sort of covered the other two better than I could. On the sex discrimination one, I mean, a lot of our legislation, Sex Discrimination Act, Race Relations Act, Equal Pay Acts, were brought in as a result of membership of the European Union. In mostly about 1976, I think the equal pay was a bit later. But they all upset the status quo. And it's really quite difficult to upset a well-entrenched status quo. I mean, we know recently in Glasgow, women were out campaigning because they were still fighting the equal pay battle, because it was meant to be equal pay for equal value. But of course, the work that women do is often undervalued by comparison with the work that men do, which accounts for the gender pay gap. I mean, I don't say the work women do, but the occupations in which women are predominantly are undervalued by comparison with the ones which men predominantly do. And that's changing, but it's changing very slowly. A lot more needs to be done with education, I think. And there's still I think, a tendency for women to go into the arts-based rather than the science-based subjects in engineering. I think there was something on the television quite recently about apprenticeships and how few women were learning to be plasterers or slaters or anything of that kind. So I think that there has to be a push at educational level as well. Yeah. I mean, I think my feeling has been that by and large, once men accustom themselves to the fact that they've got a woman working with them, they'll cope with it. But again, you get examples of serious harassment. And something more needs to be done about that. I think that's something that's come out much more into the open recently, and a very good thing with Me Too. But there's just a long way to go. And we're going to have to keep on fighting for it. And I just hope by the time my grandchildren reach employment age, then the granddaughter will be as well advantaged as the... Have you lost the mic?
No, I think you got it.
Got it.
Yeah, it's okay.
That my granddaughter will be as advantaged as my grandson in getting employment.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Elspeth. Thank you for those 3 excellent questions. You'll have a chance to put further questions to Catherine and to Elspeth over lunch. And sorry,
Maybe one more round.
oh, are you sure?
Yeah, cool.
I was working on the finishing at 12 principle, but we'll carry on per pair's good grace. So I'll take another round of questions then. I see one hand there. I know you were first. And do I see a third hand? And a lady there in a rust-coloured top.
First one is a rhetorical observation. I wonder if the whole shoot would have been better managed if it had been managed exclusively by women. But on a more serious note, and for clarification, a footprint of organisations embedded in Brussels was mentioned, but with no names of organisations, which would be interesting. And again, reference was made, as it were, to the demography and proportion of women from the United Kingdom and from Scotland, but no references to comparison with other nation states, if somebody could clarify.
Okay, so some data questions there.
Hi, thanks. My name's Trish. My background's in teaching and nursing, both of which are top-heavy professions as far as women are concerned. And it's also the worst bullies I've ever come across have been other women. So, yeah, thanks. And I also, in the 70s, when we joined the European Union, and I remember campaigning for that, I was married to a police officer, and there were female colleagues of his leaving because they didn't want to be parading up and down the high street at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning with the risk of getting a kicking from passing whoever. And I also didn't want my husband out on the streets with a 5'5" woman as his backup.
Can I possibly urge you towards a question?
That's it. It's a commentary. It's not a question.
Okay.
But it was in reference to what you said about where it comes from, and I think it comes from the home. I think it's very, very entrenched in who we see ourselves, men and women.
Okay. Can I move on then?
Thank you. Do you think that Theresa May has been given a seriously hard time over the last 2 years because she's a woman? When she arrived in the European Parliament, she certainly didn't appear to be included. She was cold-shouldered at the very beginning, so that's not quite as warm a picture as is being painted when she went there.
Okay. We had a comment second of all, so can I take a third question if there is one? Ashley.
Thank you. I'm one of the local councillors in Edinburgh, so this is the reason why I'm asking this question, is that I know that there's been various local authorities across the 4 nations that have put forward a people's vote, to that they support or endorse it. And I know that yesterday at full council we passed ours, which I'm going to say I'm quite proud of that. So one of the things I wanted to ask was that, do you think that could make a difference, and like it would maybe embolden the MPs knowing that they've got the back, or their support from the councillors, because we represent the local people and we know it from our own constituents anyway. But just
so does local councils passing motions in support for people's vote aid MPs in their actions? Okay, so we have a first question about data. What are the names of some organisations who should continue to engage with Brussels? Any comments on the demography of women from other nations within, I think, the European Parliament specifically, or anything else? Yep, no, absolutely. And then, has Theresa May been given a hard time because she's a woman, or a harder time than a man might have been given? And then Ashley's question about local authorities' motions on the people's vote.
So on specific statistics about, so you can compare, so let me think, I mean, in the European Parliamentary Labour Party, 10 out of the 20 of us that were elected, we had actually for the first time gender, in fact we had more, we had 11 at one point out of the 20, so that was quite a moment for the European Parliamentary Labour Party to have more women than men. Now that's changed because people have left and gone to Westminster or have left the Parliament to take up another job, so it's now slightly changed. But in 2014, for the very first time in my delegation, we had more women than men, if I'm correct. In terms of other delegations, I'd have to come back to you on exact statistics, but from memory, I mean, I think this Parliament has had more women than I think ever before. There's a real issue about whether we're going to have more women in the next Parliament, but frankly, having women elected, it depends on selection processes. It's all down to selection, and so we had zipping on our, certainly in the Labour Party's list, that was important to get that gender parity in the last election. And then you look at some of the systems that we've put in place in terms of twinning seats, which has been, certainly for the first Scottish Parliament election, that was very successful in trying to get gender parity between men and women. But at the end of the day, I'm only talking for one party. Each party is a different system. And so I think we need to keep pressing political parties to ensure that representation is 50-50, is reflective of society. Now, some parties, it's interesting, I think, I think it was the Conservative Party, actually at their conference, was talking about more women and encourage more women. I thought that was it was an all-women panel looking at, but encouragement's one thing, actually fulfilling that through a process is quite different. And having support through a selection process is so important, isn't it, Elspeth? Yeah. I mean, I think that more can be done within parties to do that, and is being done, but more can be done. But we'll come back to you on the actual statistics so you can see some of the breakdown, because I think in some of the countries where there are no measures, you see that more men are elected than women are elected, and they're the most resistant to change as well, if I'm honest. So a little pressure at European level is often quite helpful. So I think that's been something that's definitely there. But we'll come back to you on more in the statistics so you've got more information of that, if that's okay. On the question about, let's look at Theresa May having a hard time. I think that there has been certain comments made about Theresa May which have been quite dreadful, even from her own party, and really are reflective on her gender. And I think that's something that, and I think even Nicola Sturgeon has come to Theresa May's defence on that. Yeah. So that is true. But I think, do I think she's discriminated against being a woman at these council meetings? No, I don't. I think she's there as an equal to Angela Merkel, an equal to other leaders of their countries. So I don't see it as that. So there's elements of that. I'm in agreement with you, but in terms of how she's perceived in the European institutions, I don't think she's discriminated against at all at the European institutions. As for local authorities putting forward people's vote motions, I think that's deeply helpful. I think more people need to come out and doing that. Frankly, I wish more businesses would come out and advocate for a people's vote, because at the moment you're looking at some of the statements where they know what they have at the moment is better than what's in the withdrawal agreement, yet for some reason are saying the withdrawal agreement, we should, support it. So I would like to see not just local authorities, but more of civil society, more businesses, more people coming out and advocating for a people's vote as a solution to the kind of current crisis that our country is in. And in terms of, I think, the lady's comments about where things come from, and I think that, the more people see women in elected office, and can be more role models. And the same, I think you were talking about technology, Elspeth, as well. I mean, if you look at how few women are going into engineering, and I think there was an article yesterday, I think it was in The Guardian, of the latest head of computer science at Durham University, about trying to get more women into tech. And you just, you know, what's fascinating, if you look at that withdrawal agreement, well, actually the political declaration, 26 pages, the amount of times data flows are described is quite extraordinary. And this is the real, you know, this is the digital world that we're in, and that data and the way things work and keeping data open so we can benefit us all is equally important. So I think there's a whole issue there about how we encourage more women to look at these kind of roles as well as in politics. And those are actually quite challenging because although there's people encouraging, there's still a long way to go. Sorry, Elspeth. On the, sorry? What is it?
Footprint. So I think this is maybe something to be picked up over lunch, if that's okay, because I think there might be some detailed information for Catherine to provide, if that's all right, if you're able to wait on afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that organisations like SCVO and so on will keep. So many charitable organisations anyway have become part of the umbrella European organisation, and I hope that's going to continue as well. I mean, obviously, as with in gender, so I hope that will happen. I want to pick up a little bit on what Catherine said about data and open data. I think I'm probably become a real old fogey, but I worry a lot about social media and women's participation in politics. Because the way it works at the moment, very unpleasant people can say very unpleasant things about other people. And I think there's a particular tendency to do it about women. And I've never actually got onto Twitter or anything like that, because if somebody's saying something rude about me, which they're probably not bothering to do, I'd rather not know about it. But obviously, anybody that's engaged in active politics really has to keep up with what's going on. And I wish we could find some better way of controlling that. Because I think, again, it's something that can put women off political involvement, knowing that they could well become exposed to that kind of thing. I've now lost track of the other questions, having got upset about that one.
So we had a question about Theresa May and a question about the people's vote that I think is still unanswered.
Right. On Theresa May, again, I agree with Catherine. And I think sometimes, and I'm talking across the board, this isn't a party political remark. Sometimes I think people in Westminster, and particularly men in Westminster, think that the Parliament actually belongs to them, and it's a more important Parliament than any Parliament anywhere else. And I have a feeling that Theresa May has been suffering from that a bit. I'm sure she's fine when she's in Europe. There are a lot of very strong women in Europe, both as presidents or chancellors or equivalent of prime ministers. A lot of very strong women in the commissioners as well, where there's been a real attempt to get a good level of female participation. So I'm sure she's fine out in Europe, that she doesn't have difficulties there. But back home, yes, I'm afraid she does. And as for the people's vote, I think Catherine's absolutely right. People have to be given a straight choice. Anything that anyone can do to put any pressure on the members of Parliament to bring it about is good, whether it's local councils, whether it's business, whether it's individuals, or whatever. So please, if you think you can exert any influence, and of course only if you're in favour of a people's vote yourself, go ahead, get in touch.
Thanks very much, Elspeth. Okay, thank you all for an interesting set of questions. I think today's discussion's taken us to some really fascinating byways of the European Parliament, the structures, the way it enables women to participate as elected members, fisheries, gas appliance regulation, social media and the challenges thereof, the data flows, who's involved in some of these technical jobs and who isn't. I think we've heard really strong advocacy for the idea of thinking again on the question of the UK's relationship with Europe, particularly in the form of a people's vote. I think one of the things you said, Elspeth, today about there's being a number of bits of law and policy being there because you were there, I think that accurately summarises why anybody wants to get into politics and participate in the broader political work of our nation and of our European Union. And I hope that all of those here today will go away and reflect on that role, that political engagement that we can all do in various ways as citizens, as actively involved in politics, and as thinking, questioning people, because it strikes me that we are living in an age, and this is not an original observation, where the quality of information being discussed and disseminated in our communities is underpinning some of the really difficult decisions that we are making. And the more that we can involve ourselves as citizens in the conversation about Europe, about all matters, about women's equality, then I think we will see the number of bits of law and policy being there because elected representatives that we have engaged with are there. So thank you so much for coming along to this discussion. We will, as Per said, be hanging around over lunch, so please do have a sandwich and a drink and a bit more of a chat to us, particularly the excellent panellists. And I'd like to thank the office for organising this event, to particularly Julia for all of her excellent support of it, and wish you all safe home. Thank you.
Thank you very much.